Hello and welcome. My name is Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant psychiatrist based in private practice in Harley Street, London. And welcome to this podcast from the Royal College of Psychiatrists. I'm delighted to be joined now by Charles Fernyhough, and we're going to be talking about his latest book, the title of which is The Voices Within, The History and Science of How We Talk to Ourselves. And it's published by Profile Books. He's contributed to The Guardian, Nature, Financial Times, New Scientist, and BBC Focus. He's published many scientific articles on the relation between language and thought, and his ideas on thinking as a dialogue with the self have been influential in several fields. He's a part-time professor in psychology at Durham University, where he directs Hearing the Voice, a project on inner voices. So, Charles, welcome to the podcast. It's a fascinating book that you've written, and it's kind of about hearing voices, but it's about this thing that is so much part of our lives that we kind of take it for granted, the kind of internal conversation we are always having with ourselves, which appears to be a large part of what it is to be conscious. You say many surprising things in the book about this experience. And let's start with maybe the first surprising thing I thought in the book was you say that when we think about people who experience auditory hallucinations or hear voices, which many psychiatrists believe, of course, is a cardinal sign of serious mental illness, you say you prefer the neutral term voice hearing to the negative connotation of the term hallucination. Why do you say that?
For a long time, psychiatry has told people who have this experience that it is meaningless. It is junk. It has no value. It has no significance. But there's been a real change in the last 25 years or so where people who hear voices are sort of reclaiming their experience and saying, actually, no, this does have meaning to me. I make sense of it. People have made sense of it in different ways, in different historical periods, in different places around the world for millennia. So it is not junk. It is not some glitch in my brain. It is something that I make meaning from. It is often a very distressing and debilitating experience, but it is significant. So when you tell somebody that they're having a hallucination, you are, for many people, that is a demeaning, that is a negating way of thinking about their experience. They feel that their experience is being invalidated. So this comes from talking to people who hear voices. I made that point in the book because that's what people tell me about the way that people react to their experiences.
And it's part of a broader theme of the book, which I would argue is to challenge what we believe about what this internal experience of consciousness and this internal dialogue is. I think that one of the main thrusts of your book is we take it a little bit for granted and we make assumptions that we know what's going on because it's such a direct personal experience. But actually, we shouldn't take it for granted what's going on, and there are many possibilities. Would you agree that's one of the thrusts of your book?
Yes, I think so. I mean, one of the most gratifying things that people have said, thankfully on a few occasions about this book, is that it's really made them think differently about their own experience. And sometimes people have said that's initially quite uneasy, this way it's got you focusing differently on the ordinary stuff that goes through your mind. But on the whole, I think people are saying it's been fascinating and a source of wonder to reflect on the very varied things that are going on inside. It's not just one thing. If there's one point I wanted to make about inner speech and about voice hearing in the book, is that they are both highly varied phenomena. And I think a little bit more attention to those variations and a little bit more questioning of the assumptions we make about our experience is really valuable. So, for example, you said just now that we are all doing inner speech. Everyone does it. Well, I don't think that's true, actually. I think from the research that I've been involved in recently, I would doubt that. I think some people just don't do it or don't do it very often. So it's that sort of nuance and gradation of experience that I'm particularly interested in.
So let's go back to the beginning of the book. You say in one part of the book, there are good reasons for thinking that inner speech develops when children's conversations go underground or become internalized to form a silent version of those external exchanges. Could you say a bit about what you mean by that?
I started out as a developmental psychologist, so I'm interested in how babies and children develop, and I particularly focused on how children start to use language to regulate, to control and guide their own behavior and their thinking and their emotions. And the most interesting theory of this, to my mind, is that of the Russian psychologist Vygotsky. And I read him when I was a new graduate student a long time ago, and it really profoundly affected me because he had this beautifully simple idea that the stuff that goes on in our heads, those of us who use inner speech or conduct this internal conversation, it comes from the conversations that we have externally with other people, and particularly when we're growing up. So the idea here is that when I'm using inner speech to regulate what I'm going to do or plan the day or think through something that's happened, I'm actually conducting a dialogue with myself that has the same structure and some of the same properties as dialogues that I've conducted with other people and crucially conducted when I was growing up. So Vygotsky's theory is beautifully simple. He argues that babies are engaged in a social world from day one. They are interacting socially from the start. When language kicks in, those exchanges start to be mediated by language, by conversation. And over time, those social dialogues gradually become internalized and become taken inside so that they ultimately form the experience of inner speech. And that has certain really important implications, one of which is that inner speech should be a dialogue. It really does have the quality, the structure, the properties of a conversation between different points of view. And that, for me, is a really, really profound idea.
One of the problems, of course, though, is the difficulty thinking about thinking and the difficulty studying it. And you make the point later on in the book that, as you say, we have uniquely direct access to our own thoughts, but only to our own. That makes them hard to study. And you quote William James, a famous psychologist from the beginning of the 20th century, who made this famous quote, which goes along the lines of trying to reflect on one's own thoughts was like trying to turn up the gas quickly enough to see how the darkness looks. Could you say something about that?
There's a long history to the idea of introspection as a method for reflecting on and trying to understand our own mental processes. And it's had a pretty bad press. There was a backlash against introspection sort of in the 1950s, which is when before that with the behaviorists, and then subsequently with the 1950s when the cognitive revolution took place. And introspection has never really been fully rehabilitated. And that's partly because it's a varied thing. There are different ways of reflecting on subjective experience. There are some methods, I think, that are better than others. It's not just about sitting in your armchair like Descartes and thinking about your own thought processes. There are some really nice, sophisticated methods that we can use now to get descriptions of subjective experience. And we absolutely have to. I grew up in a tradition where psychology was about processes that you can describe in terms of input and output, in terms of behavior and so on. And what it was actually like inside to be having these experiences, some people think is beyond the realm of psychology, but psychiatry forces us to think differently, because when somebody comes to you and says they're hearing voices, they don't come to you and say, I'm experiencing disconnectivity between this part of my brain and that part of my brain. They come to you and say, I'm hearing a voice. This thing is happening to me subjectively. This thing is in my experience. So we absolutely have to have good descriptions of experience, and we have to try and tie them together with the data that we get from cognitive psychology, from neuroscience, and so on.
Now, the other problem, of course, is the ability of people to accurately report what's going on inside their heads. And again, many people find this difficult to get their heads around that psychology is suspicious, that we're not reliable reporters of our own inner conscious experience. And you give a lovely example in a review dating from 1977, I think it is, of a study where people who have trouble sleeping, may be described as suffering from insomnia, are given a placebo, and they're divided into two groups. And in the first group, the placebo is described to them as an active drug that is a stimulant and will likely keep them up. And the second group, who are also suffering from the same kind of sleep difficulties, are told that the placebo, it's still a placebo, it has no active agency. They're told that it's a relaxant and is likely to help relax them. And what happens is the opposite effect occurs in both groups. The people who are told it's an active drug that will keep them up and make them alert and keep them up at night fall asleep more easily. And the people who are told that it's a relaxant drug stay awake. Could you explain that experiment and why it's relevant to this idea that we may be inaccurate in understanding ourselves?
I think you've explained it. You've explained that particular study very well. And the review that you mentioned is one that brings together a whole load of different experimental studies, like the one you just described, and argues that we're actually not very good at reflecting on the reasons why we do certain things. We don't have very good access to our reasoning processes. So we do stuff without knowing why we've done them, and we create spurious explanations for why we've done them. And that was the thrust of that article, a famous article by Nisbet and Wilson in 1977. But what that article doesn't say is that we can't reflect on our own experience. It doesn't negate introspection as far as being able to say what something is like is concerned. Okay, and we need to, if we're studying hearing voices, for example, we need people to be able to say, this is what it is like. Because if we don't get people describing the experience in detail, we might be missing really important differences between different kinds of voice hearing experience. So we can't use the Nisbet and Wilson argument, which was incredibly influential, a real nail in the coffin of any sort of introspective method. We can't use that really as an argument against introspection per se. So there are new methods that are evolving, that are being used even in conjunction with neuroimaging, that I think give us much richer and more accurate descriptions of experience than you would get if you just reflected on your own experience without any sort of support or structure. So to give you an example, to go back to the point about everybody uses inner speech, lots of people, if you ask them, do you talk to yourself in your head? You'll hear them say, oh yes, I'm doing that all the time. But when we answer questions like that, what we might be doing is really just giving a kind of theory of our own experience. We're effectively answering it along the lines of, yeah, hang on, I've got the kind of brain I've got the kind of mind that is always talking to itself. So that's how I'll answer that question. So there's kind of presuppositions, preconceptions about experience that don't necessarily tie into what's going on moment by moment. So some of these new methods, they use different kinds of experience sampling. And basically what you do is you gain skill in responding to a beep that goes off at random intervals. And when that beep goes off, you describe what's in your mind at that moment. And if you do that, you often find that people who say they're doing inner speech all the time actually aren't doing that much. And it's through using that sort of method that I've concluded that actually often people say they're doing inner speech all the time, but when you sort of gather the data, they're not doing nearly as much of it as they think they're doing.
So this is described in wonderful detail in the book, and one of the techniques I think you're referring to is described in the book as descriptive experience sampling, and you describe the work of an academic called Russell Hulbert. And what's interesting about this technique, where the subjects wear a beeper, which goes off randomly during the day, and at that moment they have to start introspecting as to what exactly was going on at that moment, and then write it down, is this notion that you break up the everyday train of thought, and then start thinking about what's going on inside your head. And also what's very interesting about that is your book is an attempt to say, I think, that it's not the case that the only way of studying the mind and brain is to use neuroscience techniques like brain scanning, which the field seems to have been slightly fallen in love with and moved away from the idea that thinking about thinking might actually be something still very much worthwhile doing.
I think there is a concern that using this sort of method does get people so focused on their own experience that all they can do is think about their own thought processes. Actually, I've done quite a lot of research using this method, and I don't think that is the case. What you see when people get good at using this method, and it's something you have to get good at over a period of time, you have to sort of practice it. When people get good at it, they become really skilled at reflecting on their own just everyday stuff, just the stuff that's in their head at any particular moment. So I think there is a concern, but it is probably the best method that we've got. And when you can start to tie that together with the power of neuroimaging, for example, you start to glimpse a new kind of neuroscience, really, where you haven't pushed the subjective, you haven't pushed the personal out of the window. You haven't said, that's just not in the realms of science, it's too hard to study. You said, actually, we can study this. If we do it in the right way, and we use multiple methods, and we can tie it to what the neuroimaging technology is telling us about what's going on in the brain. And that becomes really exciting. So to give you one example from the book, this work is preliminary, it's hard to do, it takes time to do, therefore it's expensive. But to give you just one example, in the past, people have been interested, for very good reasons, they've been interested in what goes on in the brain when people are doing this inner speech, when they're talking to themselves silently. And some work dating back to the 1990s, some really, really nice experimental work has shown that some of the same language areas in the brain activate when you're doing inner speech. And to some extent, that's kind of what you'd expect, because it's a sort of language. So we did an experiment where we sort of basically replicated the typical method of getting people to do inner speech in the scanner. And what you do in this method is you just stick them in the scanner and you say, right, do some inner speech, and this is the thing you're going to say to yourself in the scanner. We did that, but at the same time, we're in a separate phase of the experiment. We use this experience sampling method known as descriptive experience sampling. And we captured moments when people were doing all sorts of different things, including sometimes doing inner speech. So we've got two things we can compare. We've got the situation where people are doing inner speech in the scanner because they've been told to do it. So they're doing inner speech on demand. And then we've got a situation where people are doing inner speech because they are just naturally doing inner speech. They just happen to be thinking in words at the moment that the beep goes off. And we were able to compare the brain activations in these two different scenarios. And we found they're totally different. So it's a warning that when we put somebody in a scanner and say, do something mentally, it may not actually be all that similar to the situation when they're doing that thing naturally, spontaneously, organically. And that's a methodological concern for how we go about studying all of this stuff, but including inner speech.
And moving away a little bit from now the theoretical stuff, which is still very interesting and important, and talking about some practical implications, there's a sense in which getting a better handle on this inner speech could change your life. And you give some lovely examples. There's a wonderful example in the book, which is a real example. Andy Murray, the famous tennis star, is playing a very important final in 2013, I think it is, at Flushing Meadows in the US. He's just lost a 2-set lead to Novak Djokovic, and he goes off on a break. I think it might be a toilet break. And he reports later in an interview that he talks to himself in the mirror in the men's changing room and castigates himself and tries to give himself a pep talk along the lines that he's just not going to lose this match. And then he comes back onto the court and wins the final set. And it's a crucial match and means that for the very first time, a British male tennis star has won a major ATP Grand Slam final for first time in the last 70 years or so. So it seemed as if the inner speech or the self-talk or Andy Murray taking control of his self-talk was crucial in turning around that tennis final. And it seems to be that you seem to be saying that self-talk may become really important when things start to go wrong. What are your thoughts about that?
There's a rich body of research in sports psychology on the value of self-talk. And here it doesn't have to be silent inner speech. There's another version, a kind of precursor of inner speech that we call private speech. Now, private speech is the stage where you're talking to yourself, but you're doing it out loud. And you see children doing this a lot. They sort of do their thinking on the outside so that other people can hear it. And in sports psychology, there's interest in both kinds of self-talk, the stuff that goes on silently and the stuff that goes on out loud. So quite a lot of research has been done with a huge range of different sports, actually showing that this kind of self-talk can be beneficial. It can help you in all sorts of different ways. And that fits really with what we know from the developmental psychology research, where we study private speech in children and we find they do it for all sorts of apparent reasons. They do it to plan their behavior. They do it to think through what's happened. They do it to regulate their emotions. They do it to G themselves up and motivate themselves. I think we do inner speech and private speech for all of those reasons and a whole load more. So I'm quite pragmatic and pluralistic about it. I think rather than getting bogged down in philosophical questions about the relation between thought and language, I'm interested in just what if we do this thing, what does it buy us? How is it useful? What benefits does it bring? And there do seem to be many different benefits. You know, your inner speech can guide you, chastise you, surprise you. It can make you laugh. It can encourage you and cajole you. It can do all these different things. But it is a double-edged sword. So your inner speech can be a downer as well. And one of the areas of research that I think is really ripe for further exploration is thinking about some of the negative aspects of our psychology, such as rumination and negative thoughts, that are very likely mediated by language. In other words, they are very likely happening in inner speech. But somehow the research in psychology and clinical psychology hasn't quite connected with this body of research that there is on regular inner speech. And I think that's an area of growth that we'll see being explored in the next few years.
Another really fascinating element in the book is about this idea that we think, because we only have direct access to our own inner experience, that everyone else may be having a very similar inner experience, so that may not be the case. And a particularly fascinating part of the book is where you describe what you refer to as 4 distinct kinds of inner voice. You refer to the kind of inner voice that is a faithful friend, or one that is an ambivalent parent, or a proud rival, or a calm optimist. Could you say something about these different kinds of inner voice?
Well, many people, when I talk about this area of research, and reaction is often that, oh, you're talking about the inner critic. I've got an inner critic, and I've got, it's always saying this and that to me. And I'm, my reaction to that is that makes a whole lot of sense to me. I'm interested in whether it really happens in language. So if it does happen in language, then it means it's a kind of inner speech, and that's within my remit. That's within the boundaries of what I'm interested in relation to this book. But the inner voice can also be used very metaphorically. So people can talk about the inner voice in a sort of something that guides them, or pushes them towards making certain decisions. They can be talking about something that's actually very metaphorical. In other words, they might be talking about a sort of gut instinct or a creative impulse or something that is quite easy to describe metaphorically as a voice. But I want to say, hang on, is that really a voice? Does that really have anything linguistic about it? And if it doesn't, it's still interesting, it's still important, but it's not really what I would call inner speech. So one of the things that is happening in this area of research is that people have moved away from the idea that inner speech is just one thing. People have always tended to assume that your inner speech is just kind of you, the speaker, generating this monologue which kind of accompanies your behavior. And now we know that inner speech is a much more varied thing. It can have the properties of a dialogue. It can contain other people. You can have inner conversations with other people in your inner speech. It can be more or less fully expanded or condensed. It can take on all these different properties. It's definitely not just one thing.
The other place in the book where a contrast is drawn between different kinds of experience, mental experience, is the suggestion that comes from a famous book in the 1970s by a Princeton psychologist called Julian Jaynes. The title of the book is The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And it's about an idea that ancient Greeks or ancient peoples may have experienced inner speech in a different way, that in Homer's Iliad, there's a difference between the way the heroes experience their own voices compared to the Odyssey. Could you say a bit about that and the notion that the voice of God, hearing the voice of God, may be a precursor to hearing our own voice?
Well, Julian Jaynes' extraordinary, infuriating but fascinating book always comes up in these conversations. It's had an extraordinary reach and impact, and really far broader and more penetrating than the ideas really deserve. There's so much wrong with the theory that we, at some point in our past, didn't have at the level of self-consciousness sufficient to recognize that we were talking to ourselves, and so we experienced our inner speech as the voice of the gods. I mean, there are all sorts of things wrong with it. Intriguingly, there are a couple of things that seem to be right about it that I mention in my book, but on the whole, it doesn't really wash. It doesn't hang together scientifically for all sorts of reasons, not least the fact that the changes, the effectively structural neuroscientific changes that would have had to have happened for Jaynes's theory to be correct could not possibly have happened in such a short space of time. So it's a bit of an oddity in terms of a scientific theory, and not at all well supported, but it has nevertheless been incredibly influential, and it played a huge role in the development of the Hearing Voices movement, which is a worldwide movement that's become established in large parts of the globe now over the last 25 or so years, where, as I mentioned, people who hear voices are reclaiming their experience and saying, you're not going to tell me what my experience means, kind of pointing over here to people in, from the psychiatry side of things. I'm going to tell you what my experience means, and I'm going to work it out for myself in the context of my peers and in conversation and in support groups with other people who hear voices. And it turns out that the Jaynes book was hugely influential in the history of that story.
Another very interesting part of the book was where you describe some research which found that a particular fold in the brain, referred to as the paracingulate sulcus, has a direct physical relationship, the size of it, the length of it, and the predisposition of people with that particular fold of a particular length to hear voices. And you describe a finding which is for every 1 centimeter reduction in the length of this fold of the paracingulate sulcus, your chances of hearing or of having hallucinations go up by 1/5, which I thought was a staggering finding.
Yes, that's an example of people who all had a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And we were able to take structural scans from their brains, and my colleague Jane Garrison traced the length of this particular fold. And as you describe, for every centimeter shortening of the fold, the likelihood of hallucinating went up 20%. And what was nice about that analysis is that they're all people with schizophrenia. Not everybody who has schizophrenia has hallucinations, but we were able to predict how likely they were to have hallucinations on the basis of just that structural feature. So it moves away from a kind of traditional and I think limited approach of saying, here's somebody with schizophrenia, here's somebody without any mental illness, and let's compare their brains. The idea is that this fold is something that develops quite late in gestation. It develops in the third trimester, so it seems to be particularly sensitive to other things that are going on, and so it's highly varied, among regular people who don't have any mental health diagnosis.
One final question: what's been the impact on you personally of this area? Because you've in a way had to think about what's going on inside your head as a direct result of the work that you're doing in this area and the knowledge that you've been exposed to. What would you say has been the most profound impact on you personally of this?
Well, I think an awareness and a greater sensitivity to this extraordinary richness of experience, an awareness that my way of doing things could be very different to many other people's, if not everybody else's. And also of the differing benefits and problems that inner speech can bring. I like to be easy on myself in terms of my own mentality. All sorts of rubbish goes through my head, and it does for other people as well. And some people find that problematic. Some people find that difficult. It worries them. It distresses them. I'm quite happy to have a head full of junk. I'm quite happy to have this gibberish going on because I know I can control it, or I can focus. I can have some good stuff going on as well. And that's, of course, where my writing comes from. That's where my thinking comes from. My inner speech is the vehicle through which I do all of these things. And I like to give myself a break and not be hard on myself if I'm ruminating on something, if I'm saying the same thing to myself over and over that isn't particularly constructive. It is just part of the wonder.
Well, Charles Fernyhough, it's been lovely talking to you. Fascinating. Charles Fernyhough, I've been talking to, is the author of this brilliant new book. The title of the book is The Voices Within, The History and Science of How We Talk to Ourselves, and it's published by Profile Books in collaboration with the Wellcome Collection. Charles, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Raj. Thanks for having me on the podcast.